So the main concern and the main driver of resistance has always been associated with the misuse or non-judicious use of the antimicrobial compounds. And these are really modifiable factors that can be changed. Antimicrobial resistance currently is a major concern. There's a lot of public and societal concern, and especially when it comes to using the antimicrobial compounds in the food animals. So, as it's associated with the use of antimicrobial drugs, non-judicious use, one of the ways kind of to modify the situation and put a break on what's going on is to practice judicious use of antimicrobial compounds. So judicious use of antimicrobial is basically an approach that aims to maximize the therapeutic efficacy and kind of minimize the selection pressure that exists there, the selection for the resistant microorganisms. So in the judicious use of antimicrobials, we kind of put the emphasis on appropriate and responsible use of antimicrobial compounds. And there are three major core principles which I've tried to illustrate here in this figure. The first one is to use the antibiotics when it's needed. This means that we use the antimicrobials only when they're needed to treat the animal's medical condition. So you need to use the antimicrobial compounds more for the sick animals, or when you see there's need to prevent when there's an elevated risk for a spread or an animal or a group of animals coming down with a specific disease. And then the other principle is to use the right drug for the right condition. So it means we have to use kind of specific antimicrobial product that is appropriate for that specific purpose. And the third core principle is to use the correct dose, the correct frequency, and correct duration of administration. And these are really basically the main core principles of judicious antimicrobial use. To use when it's needed, the right drug for the right condition, and use the correct dose, frequency, and the duration for the use. To kind of shift a little bit, I want to revisit the regulatory platform that exists at the moment that guide us in the use of antimicrobial drugs. So this is part of the institutional actions that have been put in place to try to mitigate the emergence and the spread of antimicrobial resistance in livestock, and also by implication also in a human population. So the main regulatory changes that I would like to highlight that have been effected recently, one is the VFD 2017, the VFD final rule, and the California Senate Bill of 2018. These regulatory changes by FDA and the Senate bill were basically effected to try to limit the use of medically important antimicrobial drugs in livestock species, and at the same time to also increase the veterinary oversight in the use of these medically important antimicrobial drugs, the MIDs. The Senate Bill 27, the California Senate Bill, as we know, it's kind of expanded on already the existing VFD that was effected in 2017. Going forward, I would also like to mention the recently issued kind of guidance by FDA, which aims to bring this happened in sometime in September of 2019. So the aim of this guidance is to bring voluntarily all the remaining approved over-the-counter medically important antimicrobial drugs under the veterinary oversight. And I specifically want to mention one of the action points that is stated in this guidance document, which point to the use of intramammary antibiotics specifically. So the goal, I think, going forward would be to kind of more put increase veterinary oversight in the use of intramammary antibiotics. That kind of directly relates to our topic of today on use of selective dry cow treatment, or in general dry cow treatment in managing mastitis. So as a follow-up to these regulatory changes, FDA actually went ahead and kind of released general information data on what has been the trend and some of the changes in the drug use. So I would like to kind of briefly point here. If you look at the first row, this table is basically highlighting the use in the approved medically important antimicrobial drugs in food-producing animals that was marketed between 2016 to 2018. So this is this is actually domestic sales and distribution data, and the unit which is used here, it's in kilograms, but this is kilograms of the active ingredients in these compounds. So in cattle, we see that there was a major decrease between 2016 to 2018, up to 30% decrease in the amount of MIDs that is used in livestock. Between 2017 to 2018, there's also another decrease of there was an increase of slight increase of 8%. But generally, the trend we're seeing here is that subsequent to the implementation of these regulatory changes, there has been some marked decrease in the amount of antimicrobial drugs that is used in the production of food animals. To kind of zoom in a little bit more and look specifically at intramammary use of medically important antimicrobial drugs, this is showing the data, the sales and distribution data between 2009 to 2018. We see that that is in the third row. It's still the same unit. It's kilograms of active ingredients in the amount of the antimicrobial sold. So we see in between 2009 to 2018, there is up to 40% decrease in amount of sales, amount of the drugs sold and distributed. In between 2007 to 2018, this is actually when the VFD came into effect. There was an additional 20% reduction in the amount of the drugs sold and distributed. So this is kind of a positive trend that we're starting to see following the implementation of these regulations. So to shift the gear a little bit more and look from the point of mastitis on the dairy, I just highlighted here the traditional mastitis control program. So this includes the milking practice, the management practice, and then the treatment. So the treatment here would be treating clinical mastitis and also dry cow treatment. I'll try to focus more on the dry cow treatment. So when it comes to dry cow treatment, there are two strategies. The common practice at the moment is to do blanket dry cow therapy, which is you basically treat all the cows that are coming in to dry that particular day. Or the alternative is to do selective dry cow therapy. In selective dry cow therapy, you're targeting only the cows that are at high risk, or the cows that come in with subclinical mastitis, and these are the ones that you treat. Cows that are deemed to be low risk, or cows that are healthy at dry off, they may not have additional benefit of receiving intramammary treatment. So basically, the whole aim of dry cow treatment is to reduce the risk of mastitis during the dry period and also in the next lactation cycle. So it's either therapeutic if the cow is coming in with subclinical mastitis, or preventative if you think there is an elevated risk of mastitis in the next lactation. So the goal, as I said, is to use antibiotics when you're doing selective dry cow treatment, is to use antibiotics to treat cows that have evidence of current intramammary infection. Selective dry cow programs typically use intramammary antibiotics to treat cows with subclinical infection, and then use teat sealants for the cows that are healthy, to kind of protect them from new infection during the dry period or during the dry period. One thing that I would like to mention here, that using selective dry cow treatment is not simply stopping the use of dry cow treatment. You kind of being more precise on the cows that you want to treat. Uh, so when you want to apply selective dry cow treatment in a herd, there are things that you'd like to consider when you want to finally make the decision to maybe transition from blanket dry cow treatment to selective dry cow treatment. And one of the things you want to know are the risk of mastitis. For example, contagious mastitis that exists on the herd. Contagious mastitis, this is by cow to cow transmission as we know it, usually during the milking process. And the major pathogens here are Mycoplasma, Mycoplasma bovis, Staph aureus, Strep agalactiae, and probably Strep oberis as well. And then on the other hand, you also want to look at the risk of environmental mastitis on the herd. So this goes back to the general management, hygiene management of the dairy. You want to look at environmental sources, the cow beddings, and then you also, when you look at environmental mastitis, you're thinking of coagulase negative staphylococcus, coliforms, or other minor species of of mastitis, a minor species of microorganisms that cause mastitis. And also still at the at the at the at the cow level, you want to kind of review the history of individual cows that come in at the drying time. You want to look at the history of clinical mastitis, and also you want to look at the last month or the monthly somatic cell count history over the ending lactation. And as an addition, there are other options which exist, including doing CMT or somatic cell count or cell cultures, but this depends on how feasible it is on a particular herd. Mainly, it depends on how many animals you're drying off at the same time and how much effort you're able to put in to do culture. Get some cows which you're going to dry them next week. You culture them and then get the same cows again, and then select the ones you want to treat, and then the one you think may not benefit from the from the treatment. But looking at general research evidence, we know that if you selectively apply dry cow treatment, but you apply it randomly, you run the risk of increasing the incidence of mastitis on your dairy, although you benefit by decreasing the amount of antibiotics that you've used. On the alternative, if you apply selective dry cow treatment using a carefully applied criteria to select the cows, also with the consideration of the hard factors, the risk factors at the hard level, you will end up reducing the amount of antibiotics that you use, and at the same time also you you don't increase the incidence of mastitis on the farm. So this has two benefits. One, you're decreasing the amount of antibiotics, you're decreasing the cost, you're also decreasing the risk, the risk of resistance on your dairy. So basically, if you're to go forward with selective dry cow treatment, there are a few questions you want to ask yourself in summary. You want to review your hard levels subclinical mastitis. You want to know what is the current status. So you review the bulk tank somatic cell count history. In general, there's an understanding that if you have more than 250,000 cells per mil in your bulk tank, probably the mastitis management on the farm is still wanting, and it probably benefit from continuing with a blanket dry cow treatment. On the other hand, if you can manage to control subclinical mastitis to a level where the bulk tank somatic cell count is lower than 250,000 cells per mil, this is an indication of a good general hygiene and mastitis management program going on that would actually enable you to make the transition from blanket dry cow treatment to selective dry cow treatment. The other thing also, you want to know the status of some of the other contagious mastitis pathogens. Your interest would be to have it free, your dairy free of staph aureus and strep agalactiae. And the other consideration you would want to look at is your ability to monitor mastitis on the farm. So you should be able to have monthly individual cow somatic cell test records. You should be able to do for stripping to identify clinical mastitis and then regular as a routine practice. And also you need to have good clinical records. This will kind of help you to know going forward if you're applying your selection, you want to be able to identify these cows based on their records. That's kind of a summary and of the general information out there, what previous research has told us. I kind of want to shift here a little bit and then give some of the outputs from our recently concluded clinical trial here. We did a randomized clinical trial for selective dry cow treatment on on California dairies. So basically what we did, we enrolled 8 herds across California and randomized all the animals that came in on the dry off day, randomized them into 4 different groups. The first group received intramammary treatment. The second group received intramammary antibiotic and titsealant. The third group, titsealant, and then the fourth, the control group, did not receive any any kind of treatment. So in total, there were 8 herds, 1,106 cows. For the different treatment groups, they were distributed as shown here: 276 for IM, 282 for intramammary antibiotic and titsealant, and 253 for titsealant, and 295 were the control. And as an outcome, there was actually no major difference in the clinical mastitis during the first 150 days in milk between all the different treatment groups. As we show here, the odds ratio, there was the lower odds ratio for IMN and titsealant, but in general, there was there was no significant difference between these odds ratio compared to the reference, the non-treated.
Emmanuel, let me interrupt you just a minute because we can't see your screen. I think you're sharing a new screen. There you go. Okay. Now we can see.
Okay. Thank you. And yeah, just to go quickly over this again with the screen being shown, uh, the randomized clinical trial, we had 4 different groups, the intermammary antibiotic group, the intermammary antibiotic and the titsealant, the titsealant group, and then the control group that didn't receive any treatment. So overall, less than a quarter of cows in all the treatment groups uh, developed clinical mastitis, and distributed as shown here. And there was no significant difference in the rate of mastitis between the different treatment groups. Although we could see here that intermammary antibiotic and the titsealant combination had the lowest odds for clinical mastitis during the first 150 days in milk. And when we looked at different other factors that would contribute to mastitis among the different treatments, one thing that stood out was the Jersey. The Jersey had the lower odds for clinical mastitis during the first 150 days in milk of 0.61. This is in comparison to the Holsteins, but again, this odds ratio was not significantly statistically significant. If you look at parity at enrollment, if the cow was of 3rd lactation or more, parity 3 or more at dry off, it had a really increased odds of developing mastitis in the next lactation, 1.65 the first 150 days in milk. Also, the TIT-N score, if the TIT-N score was more than 4 for 2 or more quarters at the time of dry off, then you'd also have significantly high odds for developing clinical mastitis. And the CMT score as well, if you had a CMT score of 3 for more than 1 quarter, you also have increased increased odds for mastitis in the next lactation. And this kind of summarizes what is out there. I will leave it now to my next presenters, to my colleagues, to get in a little bit more into the details. And I would at this point like to thank my collaborators. I'd like to thank UCNR as well that funded this study.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Emmanuel, I think we'll leave the questions to the end. Everybody can use the Q&A box to type their questions. We will try to address as many questions as we can. And yeah, Alfonso will start his talk. Before Alfonso starts, let me launch a poll here. So I think everybody, all the attendees can answer. This is just for us to, you know, have a little bit of fun during this webinar. So let me go ahead and launch this polling. It's anonymous, so everybody can just pick an option. I think you can see. I'll give you like 30 seconds or so to answer the questions. Can you see the questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Let's see if the attendees are able to answer. Hope they are. This is new, so we're playing with the pool now. Let's give a little bit more of time, and then at the end we can see the answers and compare. All right. I'll give I'll give you a few more seconds. All right. All right, I think that's good. I will, so let me end the polling here. What we have here now, we have, the majority of people responding to your first question, Alfonso, the selective dry cow therapy may be a better option now than years ago because of the following reasons: low prevalence of contagious pathogens and new diagnostic tools were the most voted. And for your second questions, what percentage of quarters have an intramammary infection at dry off? In recent North American studies, most people voted 10 to 30%. So yeah, now the floor is yours. Then we share the results with everybody, I think, you guys can see. And then at the end, we can compare these results and yeah, the floor is yours.
I see that we have a very well-versed audience here. And good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to speak to you today. I'd like to thank the DVMA for the opportunity, Fernanda and Emmanuel for the invitation, and to all of you for attending the talk. As you know, my name is Alfonso, and I work at Dairy Experts, consulting and research firm based here in Tulare. Before we start into the topic of, let's see what happened, my slides are not moving. There we go. Before we start into the topic of selective versus dry cow therapy, let's review some basics about intramammary infection dynamics. And there are like maybe 4 or 5 slides in my presentation that will overlap a little bit to what Emmanuel said, but I think what Emmanuel provided, it was a great introduction for what I'm going to say here. This graph represents the rate of new infections during the dry period of lactation. We can see a spike of new infections immediately after dry off, as well as before and after calving. It's basic epidemiology principle that if we want to reduce the prevalence of a disease, in this case mastitis, we need to either reduce the duration of the cases of the disease by curing, eliminating existing infections, and or reducing the incidence of new cases by preventing them, or both. Dry cow therapy, which is treatment with long-acting antimicrobials after large milking of lactation, achieves both by curing existing infections at the end of lactation and by preventing new infections during the dry period. Halasa students summarized about 33 papers comparing blanket dry cow therapy, meaning all quarters are treated with antibiotics, with no dry cow therapy, no antibiotics. Overall, cows receiving blanket dry cow therapy had almost 2 times, 1.78 times the risk of curing an infection and 0.61 times the risk of acquiring a new infection during dry period. Staphylococcus species, these included Staph aureus, when treated with antibiotics, had also significant higher risk of curing and numerically only, not significant, lower risk of new infections. Dry cow therapy is very effective against Streptococcus, curing existing infections and preventing new infections. And finally, not much of an effect on coliform infections. Therefore, we can conclude that dry cow therapy reduces the prevalence of mastitis. As such, it was included in the almost biblical, we can say, the 5-point plan for mastitis control. The first publication reporting the 5-point plan appears in Great Britain in 1970 and included dry cow therapy as one of the 5 strategies. Bulk tank somatic cell count in the UK decreased dramatically as the 5-point plan was being adopted. The same happened with clinical mastitis incidence. New Zealanders adopted the 5-point plan in 1974, and here in the US, the NMC adopted the 5-point plan in 1979. Okay, let's go into the topic of selective dry cow therapy. As Emmanuel said before, selective dry cow therapy is the treatment with long-acting antimicrobials of only cows or quarters identified with or at risk of having an intramammary infection at dry off or at risk of acquiring one infection during the dry period. Conversely, blanket dry cow therapy consists in the treatment of every quarter of every cow at dry off. Currently, North America and most of Europe, with the exception of Sweden, use dry cow therapy. Some countries like US, Canada, Belgium, Spain, Hungary, Italy, Poland, and United Kingdom, over 80% of farmers will apply blanket therapy. However, Nordic European countries like Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, and West as the Netherlands, moved from blanket dry cow therapy to a selective treatment approach. Why they did it? Why we also may want to do that? In Nordic countries and the Netherlands, it was mainly a government regulation. Nordic countries only allow the selective use of antibiotics, and the Netherlands banned the preventive use of antibiotics in food animals. Then you cannot use antibiotics for prevention in the Netherlands in food animals. In the US and Canada, we still do not have the same level of government policy, but there are reasons why producers may choose to reduce the use of antibiotics at dry off. There are public health concerns, as Emmanuel was mentioning, economic returns via reduced labor at dry cow cost. Introduction of application tube in the teat canal is also not totally risk-free. And those whys make sense given that cow therapy represents about 1/3 of the antibiotics used on dairy farms. But why now? There are several conditions that make us think that selective dry cow therapy may work. Low prevalence of intramammary infections at dry off, lower prevalence of contagious pathogens such as strep A and staph aureus, and we have new tools, teat sealants. They are effective at decreasing intramammary infections, as well as diagnostics to identify infected quarters or cows. Low intramammary infections, we see that the bulk tank somatic cell count dropped dramatically in the last few decades, from about 300,000 at the end of the 90s to below 200,000 now. Recent studies from herds across the US indicate that only 20% of the quarters are infected at dry off and about 15% at calving. 30 years ago, near 50% of the quarters were infected at dry off. Gram-positive bacteria represent 90% of quarter infections. Gram-negative bacteria and other organisms, the other 10%. There were no strep A in these herds from these 6 herds from California, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and staph aureus was only present in 2.5% of the quarters at dry off and 1.3% of the quarters at freshening. Teeth sealants are effective at preventing new infections in man as well, of course. When cows receive antibiotics and teeth sealants are dry off, compared with only antibiotics, cows had 0.71% times the risk of having a new intramammary infection. When cows receive teeth sealant only at dry off, compared with antibiotic only, cows had about 0.84 times the risk of acquiring a new intramammary infection. Therefore, they are at least as effective, if not more effective, than antibiotics in preventing new infections. When cows receive teeth sealant only at dry off, compared with receive nothing, cows had 0.33%, not 0.33%, 0.33 times the risk of having a new intramammary infection. This reduction in new intramammary infections when using a teeth dip also translate into a reduction in clinical mastitis. Therefore, we have new tools that are effective. Now the question is how to select, and this is the big question. How do we know which herds are the best candidates? Like Emmanuel mentioned before, it has been shown that, or it has been proposed that selective dry cow treatment only should be used in herds with a ball tank somatic cell count of less or equal to 250,000. Very important, herds that have hygienic dry-off procedures, extremely important, and very low prevalence of contagious pathogens. However, there is a risk, there is a lack of research addressing this question. And the big question, how do we know which cows and or quarters are infected or have higher chances of becoming infected? Now is when the rubber hits the road. I'm going to summarize several studies from the last 10 years evaluating different selective dry cow therapy strategies. Already a few years ago, Pevi Rayala and colleagues, when she was at Ohio State, enrolled over 700 cows from 4 small to large herds, producing a decent amount of milk. The somatic cell count from 3 of the 4 herds will be considered high today. Culling rate and calving interval was average for the US, and housing conditions considered conventional for the different site herds. Intramammary infection prevalence at dry off and calving were not high in any of the 5 herds, and low prevalence of contagious pathogens. Low risk cows were defined as cows, then in this case they use cow records. They did not use any quarter record, and not quarter record, culture of quarters, etc. And low risk cows were defined as cows with clinical mastitis, or I should say without clinical mastitis, and with somatic cell count less or equal to 200,000 cells per milliliter during each of the last 3 months of lactation. If a cow experiences a case of clinical mastitis during the first 90 days of the lactation preceding the dry off, but her somatic cell count were less than 100,000 for the rest of lactation, she was also classified as a low-risk cow. Low-risk cows represented 48% of the cows in the 4 herds were assigned to either a blanket dry cow therapy group, 4 quarters treated with antibiotics, or to a group where cows were not treated with antibiotics. Teeth sealants were not used in this study. Milk yield were no different between treated and not treated cows. 2 herds producing more milk and 2 herds producing less milk when they were blanket treated. However, which was a good thing, that no effect on milk yield. However, somatic cell count was slightly lower for low-risk cows assigned to blanket dry cow therapy. This effect was observed in 3 of the 4 herds. Then these were not a positive. Scott McDougall in New Zealand defined, also using cow records again, define low-risk cows as cows with a somatic cell count equal or below 150,000, a total test during lactation, and no clinical mastitis history. Again, low-risk cows, in this case, 53% of the cows in 6 pasture herds were assigned to either a blanket dry cow therapy group, 4 quarters treated with 2 different antibiotics, or to a group where cows were not treated with antibiotics. Again, teeth sealants were not used in this study. Low-risk cows had a higher risk of having an intramammary infection during the dry period. This is not a surprise, given not teeth sealants were used and the high rate of new infections due to environmental stress that experience New Zealand. Not really good. Also, they had more clinical mastitis after calving in this study. Okay, then finally, Sherpensel and colleagues, again, only using cow records, define low-risk cows. These were Dutch herds, 97, are fair lactation cows with a somatic cell count of less than 150, and mature cows with a somatic cell count less than 250 at last test. Then they use different criteria for fair lactation, 150. The mature cows, they use 250 at the last test. This was a split udder design. Then that means 2 cows of these low somatic cell counts were treated with antibiotics, and 2 cows and 2 quarters, were not treated. Again, teeth sealants were not used in this study. The 2 quarters not treated with antibiotics had a somatic cell count, and high proportion of them were above 200,000 after calving, and the other 2 quarters treated with antibiotics. The same happened for clinical mastitis. This study was a good study. However, we should interpret split other studies, or the interpretation, I should say, sounds better. The interpretation of split other studies should be with caution due to interdependence between quarters. Okay, then now we are going to reporting a study done by Cameron and colleagues at Prince Edward Island, where they not only use cow records, but they did CMT and culture quarters. Then what they did is they defined low-risk cows as cows with a monthly somatic cell count below 200,000 on the last 3 milk tests prior to dry off. No evidence of clinical mastitis during the same time period. No antibiotic treatment within the last 14 days. Equal or greater to 3 functional quarters. An expected dry period of no less than 30 days and no more than 90 days. And a CMT score less than 2 in all 4 quarters. Okay, then now on those low-risk cows, which were 47% on the cows on the 16 herds, were assigned to either a blanket dry cow therapy group, 4 quarters treated with antibiotics, or to a selective dry cow treatment group, where cows were only treated with antibiotics if they had significant growth in a composite sample from all 4 quarters. Cows assigned to both treatment groups received an internal teeth sealant. There were no difference between both groups in quarter-level bacteriological cure risk, and no difference in new risk of intramammary infections, no difference in clinical mastitis after calving. But the only negative aspect of this approach of this study was that only 20% of the cows were not treated. Then they end up treating 80% of the cows. Amy Vasquez, when she was doing her PhD at Cornell, and Daryl Naidon, defined low-risk cows are those that had all the following criteria. Somatic cell count less or equal to 200,000 at last test, an average somatic cell count less than 200,000 over the last 3 tests, no signs of clinical mastitis at dry off, and no more than 1 clinical mastitis event in the current notation. Low-risk cows, which were 60% of the cows, this was only 1/3, were randomly assigned to receive intramammary antibiotics and external teeth sealant only, or only external teeth sealant at dry off. Okay. Then bacteriological cure was significantly higher for low-risk cows assigned to the group receiving antibiotics. However, new intramammary infection risk were not significantly higher. Then we have negatives and we have positives. No difference in milk production, the exact same milk production after calving. The same, no difference in somatic cell count, no difference in clinical mastitis, no difference in culling after calving, which is good. Kritika Patel, a veterinarian that works with us at Dairy Experts, when she did her master at Minnesota with Sandra Godden, they randomly assigned 56 cows, this was really a tiny study, to a blanket dry cow therapy or selective dry cow therapy. For cows in the selective dry cow therapy group, milk from each quarter was cultured using a rapid culture system, with results record as bacterial growth or no growth. At dry off, in the blanket dry cow therapy group, were infused with antibiotics and internal teeth sealant in all 4 quarters. For cows assigned to the selective dry cow group, quarters with bacteriological group were infused with an antibiotic plus internal teeth sealant, while quarters with no growth were infused with internal teeth sealant only. Only 52% of the quarters were treated with antibiotics in cows assigned to the selective dry cow treatment group, and although a small number of cows, as I mentioned before, there were no significant difference in bacteriological cure risk or new intramammary infections during the dry period. Then this was a small study, but good results. Okay, then with all this good news, myself and other researchers wanted to launch a clinical trial across the US with farms on different states using new diagnostics and new intramammary infections prevention tools. And in order to do that, we needed some money. And Sandra Godden, this lady you see in the picture, from the University of Minnesota, she led the effort together with Daryl Naidon from Cornell, Pat Gordon from Iowa State, and myself from Dairy Experts. We applied for the grant and we got it. to finance the project. Then intramammary antibiotics, I should recognize Zoetis for donating the intramammary antibiotics and the teeth sealant. Sunrow, Australian, who just finished his PhD and now he took a faculty position at the University of Sydney. He was the PhD student from Sandra and was key on the success of this project. He coordinated different sites, managed and analyzed the data, prepared manuscripts, very successful. 2 of them have been already published at the journal Day Science, one at Preventive Veterinary Medicine, and others, including some economic papers, are being or are going to be submitted for publication in the next few months. Okay, our study objective was to compare 2 selective dry cow treatment programs to blanket dry cow therapy. And we wanted to evaluate antibiotic use at dry off, intramammary infection dynamics during the dry period, and even more important, health and productivity in the first 121 days of lactation. A total of 1,775 cows from 7 herds in California, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, and New York were enrolled during the summer of 2018. Herds range from 800 to 5,700 cows, bolt-on somatic count 90 to 230,000 cells per milliliter, and bedding was sand or dry manure in most of the herds. Herds D and E are actually California herds and represented half of the cows enrolled in this study. At dry off, the 1,275 cows were randomly assigned to either blanket dry cow therapy, culture-guided selective dry cow therapy, or algorithm-guided selective dry cow therapy. Then we have 3 groups. All quarters from cows assigned to blanket dry cow therapy receive Spectramast, DC, and Orbicil. The culture selective group. Individual quarter milk samples from all cows, independent of the group where they were assigned. Then the 4 quarters, or 3 in some cases, because the criteria were 3 or more quarters, was to we culture the quarter from the old cows in the laboratory. Okay. However, milk from quarters of cows assigned to the culture-guided selective dry cow treatment group were also cultured using the Minnesota ICF forecast plate. As you can see, there is a quadrant for each quarter. It's very similar to a blood plate, a blood agar plate. Everything grows there. Quarters with any growth were considered culture positive quarters and received Spectramast dry cow therapy, Spectramast dry cow, and Orbicil. Quarters without growth were considered culture negative quarters and only received Orbicil. On cows assigned to the algorithm guide selective dry cow treatment group, the treatment decision was at the cow level. Then in the previous one, on the culture-based group, was at the quarter level. Here, the treatment decision was at the cow level. That means either all quarters from a cow were treated or none of the quarters were treated. If a cow met any of the following criteria: somatic cell count greater than 200,000 at any test during current lactation, then any test during the lactation before dry off. She was at greater than 200,000. She was treated with antibiotics. Any clinical mastitis case in the last 14 days of lactation, or 2 or more clinical cases during lactation. If she met any of these criteria, she was treated with a spectrum mast and Orbesil. If not, she received only Orbesil. Thereafter, cows went dry. We chose cows that had a dry period between 30 and 90 days. And we culture again at the laboratory all quarters from these cows at calving, in order to evaluate the impact of these dry off strategies in outcomes with economic value. We follow these cows up to 120 days into lactation. Therefore, as mentioned before, outcomes included antibiotic use, a dry off, dry period infection dynamics, including cure risk, new intramammary infections, and prevalence of intramammary infection at calving, health and production outcomes, clinical mastitis incidence, culling and death events, somatic cell count, and milk production. Okay, let's go into results. The graph shows the percentage of quarters treated with antibiotics for the different treatment groups. Blanket, represented by a red bar, culture by a blue bar, and algorithm by a green bar. As you can see, the number of quarters treated with antibiotics, meaning the number of antibiotic tubes used, was reduced by 55% in cows assigned to culture or to algorithm, then the same number of reduction of use of antibiotics for both strategies. In terms of cure, quarters with an intramammary infection at dry off and the absence of that infection at calving were considered cured. We see that the cure risk was about 90% independent of the group to which those cows were assigned. No difference there. A new intramammary infection were defined as an infection present at calving but absent at dry off. We see that new intramammary infection risk was about 15%, and again, independent of the group to which those cows were assigned. Similarly, if we take a snapshot of milk cultures at calving, we see that the prevalence of infection at the quarter level was 17% for all treatments. The left Kaplan-Meier here represent clinical mastitis events, and the one other to the right represents culling or death events during the first 120 days in lactation. We can see that the line representing the 3 study groups go together. Putting numbers on those, 12 to 15% of the cows had a clinical mastitis event in the first 120 days in milk, and around 10% of the cows were culled on their herds during the first 120 days. Again, no statistical difference among groups. Again, representing outcomes with economic value, the graph at the left represents the log somatic cell count, and the one at the right, the milk yield up to 120 days in milk. It's difficult to, we see that they are almost overlap. We see very low somatic cell count, And we see that independent of the group where these cows were assigned, they produce about 106 pounds of milk during those 120 days in milk. Okay, then to wrap this up, the strengths of the study was large sample of cows and herds implementing a commercial dairy farm from multiple regions across the US, gold standard lab methods. The limitations were the protocols were implemented by study personnel. Then our people did apply intramammary antibiotics. Our people did apply teeth sealants. We may not be able to generalize to herds with poor managed mastitis practice. In summary, the overall low prevalence of infection, low prevalence of contagious pathogens at dry-off, as well as global tendencies and domestic demands may require that we consider selective dry cow therapy as an alternative. We also have new selection tools and teeth sealants that will help us on the decision-making process. Most recent studies, this show that we may be close to make selective dry cow therapy efficacious and feasible. However, I should mention a word of caution. Selective dry cow therapy needs hygienic practice at dry-off, like also blanket dry cow therapy. Also, you have to have hygienic practices, but it should be carefully implemented and needs monitoring. Thank you for your attention, and I'll answer any question you have at the end of the presentation. Let me just, before I switch to Fernanda, not this one, sorry, I thought I had it open.
Alfonso, while you're opening the file, let me launch the pool again so then people can play a little bit with the questions. Can I?
Yes, please.
So let me launch this one here. Just a second. Let's launch the other one from Alfonso. There we go. I think people, can you see the pool? I think so, right? So I think if people can just choose the options and answer, so then we can compare the response before and after.
Yeah, I can see the poll.
Oh, so maybe, yeah, so maybe Alfonso needs to stop sharing. So let me end the poll.
Okay.
And okay, go ahead, Alfonso. You can.
Actually, I'll stop sharing. The file I was looking for, I thought I had it open. If somebody wants to implement selective dry cow selective dry cow therapy in their herds following this criteria, I have a document with a set of commands very easily to prepare in dairy comp, and then I think if you want to use the algorithm, it's very easy, and I'll be happy to share it with any of you. Just shoot me an email and I'll be sharing it with you. If you prepare for such document to Valley Agriculture Software, they also will be happy to share it with you.
Great. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, so if you don't mind sharing your, stop sharing your screen, sorry.
Yes. Let me see. Please. Let me see, because I don't know. Okay, I don't see that anymore. Just a second. I'll have to find it. Where is
I think, there you go. Can I stop from here? I'll do it.
I can stop the video, but I don't. Oh, stop share. There you go. Sorry.
Oh, good. All right. All right, so let me launch the poll here. Just give 1 minute. Do you want to continue? Yes, so people can play a little bit while I open my presentation here. All right. So, can you see the poll?
Yes.
All right, good. So if you could vote, I'll give you just 30 seconds more, then we can, I can get started on my presentation. People are voting, great. All right, so let me end the polling here. 1 second, and let me share with you all the results. So, oh yeah, Alfonso, I think you did a good job showing the benefits or potential benefits of using teeth sealants. For your first question, why selective dry cow therapy may be a better option now than years ago. The majority here responded the availability of teeth sealants, new diagnostic tools, and low prevalence of contagious pathogens. Vast majority responded that 10 to 30% of quarters in North America have an intramammary infection. The majority said that at least teeth sealants are at least effective, if not more effective, when compared to intramammary antibiotics. And when you ask which one of the following treatment criteria were included in the algorithm from the nationwide clinical trial that you and colleagues conducted, majority said 2 or more clinical mastitis cases during lactation, but all the options were responded. So yeah, great job. So again, I just would like to remind everybody that if you have questions, you can type them on the Q&A box, and we will share the recorded link for the webinar later as well. So, all right, so let me now get started here and share my screen with you all. All right, share screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, good. So first, thank you, Emmanuel and Alfonso. They did the hard work here. I think they set the stage very well for what we're going to discuss now. As Nadia has already introduced me, but my name is Fernanda. I work at the VetMed Teaching and Research Center here in Tulare. I am a cooperative extension specialist with Emmanuel. We work together. And the topic that I'm going to talk about today to wrap up this discussion is about the economics. So basically the economic risks and the benefits of implementing selective dry cow therapy as a management strategy. And before I get started on the numbers and on the decision-making discussion here, I'd like to thank my co-authors, Nina, Bart, and Hank, especially Nina. Nina is the graduate student who did the hard work here, who developed the models, who helped me pulling the data from the DHI and from the farmers. So thank you very much, and let's get started. So after Emmanuel and Alfonso's presentation, basically we are left with these 2 questions. One is, should we use less antibiotics, implementing a selective dry cow therapy program, but maybe having a greater risk of mastitis, although more recent studies, especially here in North America with the use of teat sealant, have shown no differences, but this might be something that we are a little bit afraid of. Or should we be more conservative, have a lower risk, and continue to use a blanket dry cow therapy? That's when economics can help, because economics can help with decision making. And the questions that we are trying to answer, although I don't think we're going to be able to answer, but at least we're going to be able to provide some numbers to help you and farmers to make a better decision. Some of these questions are, is it economically feasible to implement selective dry cow therapy? Or what would be the overall cost of mastitis in my herd if I implement a strategy like that? What would be the risk? Is that worth taking the risk? So these are questions that we are going to try to discuss a little bit today during this presentation. So before we jump into numbers, I just want to introduce you to a concept that we talk a lot, which is this CMDP, or cost of mastitis around the dry period. So for us, when we're discussing strategies at dry off and potential consequences of this strategy, we're talking about mastitis around the dry period. What is that? So basically, we have the dry off. When we dry off the cows, we have, what are the costs that we have? We have the costs with the tubes. We have, if we use teat sealant, the cost with teat sealants. We have the labor costs. When we when these cows calve, they may have subclinical mastitis. If they have subclinical mastitis during especially 90, the studies vary. Sometimes they look at the first 120 days in lactation. Emmanuel's study look at 150 days in lactation. Here we're going to focus on the first 90 days of lactation. But if this cow has subclinical mastitis, her losses will be associated with lower milk production, because we know that happens. If she has clinical mastitis, the losses will be associated with tubes, treatment of these animals, discarded milk, labor, and when we sum all these costs together, that's what defines the cost of mastitis around the dry period. So I'm not talking about the cost of one case of clinical mastitis. I'm talking about the sum of costs and potential losses of a decision that we make when we're drying off these cows. And here, I'm not going to talk about cooling. There might be, especially old papers, they talk a little bit about cooling, but mainly because of what Alfonso presented, the most recent papers have shown no difference in the cooling rate. But we could add the cost of cooling if we want to be more detailed or more specific when we're calculating this cost, if there is an increase in cooling rates if we implement selective dry cow therapy. So basically this figure, I like this figure. This is a figure from this paper, 2007. These two authors, actually this publication is maybe the first publication that addresses economics of a selective dry cow therapy, but selective in the sense that we're talking about today, which cows should receive antibiotics. Old publications, when they talk about the economic costs of different strategies at dry off, they're basically comparing blanket dry cow therapy and no dry cow therapy at all. And in all these old papers, blanket dry cow therapy is economically more interesting than not treating cows at all. Now in 2007, this publication, these authors, they have this figure in their paper that I like a lot, because this figure will help you to understand the logics behind all the economic calculations that we do. When we're doing calculations, for us, or for the authors that develop these models and economic calculations, what matters are probabilities, are the risks of new infections, risks of cooling, risks of cure. And that's basically what this figure is about. So what the authors did, they modeled a herd. It was a small herd, 100 cows herd. And then each cow in that herd had a milk production. And then these cows, they had a probability to have an intramammary infection at dry off. And that's exactly what happens in the dairy. Some cows will have, others won't. And then they will also have a probability of being treated or not, depending on the sensitivity and the specificity of the algorithm that you decide to use. Alfonso presented at least 3 or 4 different papers with different algorithms, and all these algorithms have different sensitivity and specificity, which is basically your capacity to correctly identify cows that have an infection and need a treatment, or that don't have an infection and you're not going to treat with antibiotics. If these cows, they receive treatment, they might cure, or if they don't receive treatment and have an intramammary infection, they might have a spontaneous cure or not. And of course, these are the probabilities. I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but I think you can. And then they might have an intramammary infection or not during the dry period. And when they calve, they might have or not an intramammary infection at calving. And during this beginning of their lactation, they might have show or not case of clinical mastitis or subclinical mastitis. And then this is I would say that is a summary of what we do when we develop an economic model. We play, or we go into the literature, we get all these probabilities, we create a model herd, and then we play with these probabilities and economic costs to get to the numbers. So basically, when we look at this figure, we can ask ourselves, where is the economic opportunity here? So basically, the economic opportunity is that because not all cows have an intramammary infection at the dry off, and some will cure spontaneously, not all cows will get infected during the dry period, which means that when we implement a blanket dry cow therapy, we might be treating cows with a cost that maybe they wouldn't have to be treated. Okay, so that's what is where the economic costs are. That's where they are. Plus, and we are not going to discuss here, but as Emmanuel mentioned in the beginning, there is this consumer perception, and of course regulations on antimicrobials use that we have to be aware of. So a summary of this 2007 paper that was done by these researchers, Hoops, I don't know how to say his name, and Hoheven, and what they did, they created a lot of different scenarios based on a bunch of different contagious pathogens. It's a very interesting paper, but in summary, what they showed was that, and again, just a comment here, these were using economic inputs from the Netherlands. That's why the results are in euros. But we don't have to be too attached to the numbers, but more attached to the logics behind these numbers. So what they showed that if you do a blanket dry cow therapy, on average, your costs per cow, this is cost per cow per year, of the clinical, mastitis around the dry period will be a little bit greater than if you implement a selective dry cow therapy. However, the variation, and where is this variation coming from? It's coming from the variation of the herds. So the variation, if you implement a selective dry cow therapy, is bigger than if you implement blanket dry cow therapy. And the conclusion of this paper is that as I said, the selective dry cow therapy can be the best economical option, but small change in the rate of infection may change the results, mainly the cost of clinical mastitis in the subsequent lactation, the cost of antibiotics, and labor. This will have a big impact on the total cost. Another insight that I think it's interesting for us to discuss briefly about came from Scherpenzel and co-authors in 2016. They used to develop this model, they used data from the trial that Alfonso presented from the 2014 trial, basically almost 1,700 cows from 97 herds in the Netherlands. they calculated the cost of clinical mastitis. This is each case of clinical mastitis with the inputs that they used was 221 euros. Subclinical mastitis, they assumed that one case of subclinical mastitis incurs in losses of almost 1.8 pounds of milk per day, and it has on average 80 days of duration. And based on the last test day of the cows, they divided this cow in different categories of somatic cell count to play with an algorithm that I will very briefly explain to you what they did. And I'm doing this because this will help you to understand what we did here in California. So basically they created 8 different scenarios. Each scenario, they varied the threshold below which they would not treat these cows at dry off. So for instance, the first scenario, the threshold is 0, which means that is a blanket dry cow therapy. Everybody receives antibiotics. The second scenario is a threshold 50-50. The first number here is first lactation cows, or cows that are going to their first dry period. The second number are multiparous, or cows that have multiple dry periods. So basically, regardless if they're multiparous or primiparous or multiparous, these cows would not receive antibiotics only if their last test day was below 50,000 cells. And the same thing with all the other categories. So these are the thresholds. When we look at the costs, and this is cost per herd, remember this is 100 cows herd, this is in euros with their own inputs. When we look at the costs, these costs vary slightly, but the lowest cost was scenario 5. What is scenario 5? Scenario 5 is a scenario in which primiparous cows, or cows that are going to their first dry period, if on their last test day they were below 150,000 cells, they would not receive antibiotics. Everything above that would receive antibiotics. And for the multiparous cows, the cows that were below 50,000, they would not receive antibiotics. So they're being very conservative here. If they were above 50,000, they would receive antibiotics. And if we compare now the herd incidence, the overall herd incidence of clinical mastitis, the prevalence of subclinical mastitis, and the amount of antibiotics, or what they call the animal daily dosage of antibiotics, we will see that this scenario, although it was the lowest cost, it was not the scenario with the lowest incidence of clinical mastitis, was not the scenario with the lowest prevalence of subclinical mastitis, and it was not the scenario with the lowest use of antibiotics. The take-home message here is economics not always having the lowest incidence or prevalence of a disease is the most economic alternative. There is a trade-off because you have to invest. There are costs associated with keeping the disease low. Of course, this is an economic model, and as I said, we have to take this as one more input for us to make better decisions, not as the final answer for our questions. So what about California? Most of these papers, especially the economic ones, actually all the economic ones, they were done in Europe with European inputs, with European economic values. So what we wanted to do, we wanted to look at the California numbers and understand a little bit what would be the economic costs and potential of implementing selective dry cow therapy here in California. So 2 things, I mean, it might be obvious, but I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page. When I talk about incidence risk of subclinical mastitis, I'm looking at cows that had somatic cell count with at the last test day before dry off below 200,000, and then when they calved on their first test day of the subsequent lactation, their somatic cell count was above 200,000, and the other way around for the cure risk of subclinical mastitis. And this is important because this is an input in our model, and as you see when I present that. And this is also interesting because we can look at these numbers using dairy comp. So I know that the graph here is very small, but basically on the x-axis here, we have the log of somatic cell count at dry off. On the y-axis, we have the first test day log of somatic cell count. On this bottom quadrant here, we see the healthy cows. They were healthy, continue to be healthy. On the upper quadrant here on the left, these are the cows that were healthy and now they have an infection. And on this bottom right quadrant here, we can see the cows that had an infection and then they cured during the dry period. And of course, on the upper right quadrant are the cows, the chronic infected cows. And we can actually use these numbers. We can do a 2x2 table from dairy comp, and we can use these numbers, for instance, for this specific herd, the cure risk of mastitis, of subclinical mastitis was almost 80%, and the incidence risk was almost 16%. And using data that we have on farm, we can actually play with the numbers and understand, have a better grasp for that specific herd, what would be the cost of mastitis, and that's what I want to show you. So the first thing that we did, we got data from Agritech. Bill was very kind to provide us with data from 2009 to 2017 of all herds enrolled in a DHI testing program here in California. And we look at the incidence risk of subclinical mastitis around the dry period. So I'm only talking about cows that were healthy at the dry off, and when they calved with an infection, a subclinical infection. And then we saw this very nice seasonal pattern, right? The overall incidence risk along the years was 0.18. And we can see there was a slight increase, and this agrees with when we look at the bulk tank somatic cell count from other sources for California. There was a slight increase in the last few years. But when we look at the distribution of the herds here, we have herds, 25% of the herds have an overall incidence rate of mastitis, subclinical mastitis, around the dry period of 13%. And of course, we have 25% of the herds that are above 22%. And these numbers are important, especially when we want to compare the reality of California with some of the clinical trials that Alfonso discussed about. Now, when we look at the cure risk, we see the overall cure risk of 0.69%, 69%, with a variation between 60% and 75%. So there is a variation within herds, and that's why it's important for us when we are looking at, or when we're advising a farmer on adopting or not, we have to take into consideration the specifics of that herd before making that decision. Another thing that we decided to take a look at was at what is the last test day somatic cell count for primiparous and multiparous cows in California along the months. So what we saw, this first graph here on your left is the primiparous, and the blue line on the bottom is the percentile 25. What that means? That means that, for instance, in January, 25% of the primiparous cows that were dried off, so remember, this is last test day, somatic cell count, they had less than 30,000 cells. When I go to the P50 or the medium values, 50% of my cows had, a little bit over 50,000 cells. When I look at my P75 or the 75th percentile, we can see that 75% of the cows that were dried off, primiparous cows, in January, they had less than 150,000 cells. So this is an amazing opportunity for us when we are looking at the last test day somatic cell count, an opportunity to think about implementing selective dry cow therapy. And of course, I have here above this yellow line, I have 25% of my cows that are above 250,000 cells that would most likely not be eligible to not receive antibiotics at the dry off. And here's the same thing with multiparous. As you can see, the y-axes are different. And this is because the multiparous, we have higher somatic cell count as expected. So 25% of my multiparous, they have below a little bit less than 100,000 cells at dry off in January. As you can see, there is a seasonal pattern, but the seasonal pattern is much more evident when we look at the high somatic cell count animals in this herd. And I think this gives us an insight, oh wait, we're having a big number, a large number of cows, primiparous and multiparous, that are going to the dry off with a low somatic cell count at the last test day. So that's good. Then we decide to look at the distribution of herds according to bulk tank somatic cell count, because as Emmanuel and Alfonso said, herd bulk tank somatic cell count may be something that indicates if the herd is ready or not to implement this management strategy. As I mentioned, the overall bulk tank somatic cell count in California is good. There was this slightly increase in the last years, but when we look at the distribution of herds, what we can see here is that we have 5% of herds that have on average 91, a little bit over the 90,000 cells. This is a yearly average in 2017. And if we take the threshold of 250,000, we have at least, say 62.5% of the herds that have an opportunity based on the bulk tank somatic cell count to at least think about implementing selective dry cow therapy. Now, what we did, as I said, we went to Agritech. We asked them for all this data. So we basically had records from 2009, 2017, from 376 California herds. We had more than 1.5 million lactations with subsequent lactation information, because we needed to understand what was happening in the following lactation. We look at the somatic cell count at dry off at the last test day, and we look at the somatic cell count in the next lactation up to 50 days in milk. And this was to explore the incidence risk of subclinical mastitis. Now for clinical mastitis, because of course, if we're implementing selective dry cow therapy, you also have to look at the risk of clinical mastitis. What we had to do, we had farmers collaborating with us. We had heard data from 6 herds that are known for very well record keeping. We had records from 2012 to 2019. We randomly selected almost 10,000 lactations from cows with parity varying from 1 to 8. Of course, all these cows had next lactation information. We look at the somatic cell count at the dry off, at the last test day, and we look at the clinical mastitis in the next lactation up to 90 days in milk. One important thing to keep in mind here is that all these herds, as well as the herds coming from the Agritech data or the HIA data, they use blanket dry cow therapy. So all the information that we got from these data applies to a scenario where blanket dry cow therapy is being applied. But to compare, we have also to have data from selective dry cow therapy. So what we did, initially, we had no data from farms implementing selective dry cow therapy. And I put a star here because actually we did have, but because it was just one, we decided not to use for this first analysis. Now we have data from other farms, and we are going to start using that as well. What we decided to do, we decided to go on the literature, and then we decide to be a little bit more conservative, and especially based on that work that Alfonso presented for Sherp and Zell in 2014, we decided to use a number or a penalty system for the, if you decide, instead of using blanket, if you decide to use selective, we said, okay, I'm not going to go into details here, but basically based on literature, we said, okay, if you don't use antibiotics, your risks for clinical and subclinical mastitis will increase by 62%. What are the challenges? Alfonso highlighted them very well, especially Sherp and Zell did a split udder design. They only compared, they did not use sealant, so we basically compared antibiotics versus nothing. They use different algorithms to select the low risk cows. They used clinical mastitis up to 100 days in milk. And what they saw was a 70% increased odds of clinical mastitis in partners dried off without antibiotics. And of course, a higher incidence of subclinical mastitis in the next lactation. But the cool thing that we did here is because we had such a big data set, we did a regression. And I'm not going to show you here, but if you are interested in seeing these numbers, we're about to publish this paper. But what we did a regression. We look at, okay, based on all this information that we have from subclinical and clinical mastitis in California, what is the probability of cows that are dried off in different thresholds of somatic cell count at the last test day? What is the probability of they having mastitis, clinical mastitis, or subclinical mastitis in the next lactation? So we did that to create our herd. And these are some of the values that we assumed. So basically, we simulated a 1,000 cow herd, and we simulated 3 herds. We basically varied the book tank somatic cell count. So if we were talking about a herd that has a very low book tank somatic cell count, or a herd that has a little bit higher somatic cell count, we assumed the 35 pull rate, labor cost, teat sealant cost, cost of the tube. All these inputs came from market values and experts. We assume a milk price of $19 per hundredweight, and this is actually a historic average. I think if we put the actual numbers, this number will go down. We also assumed the milk losses due to subclinical mastitis. We assumed it to be the length of this milk production loss will be 85 days based on literature, 1.9 pounds. And we assume the feed cost, because of course, if this cow is producing less milk, she's going to eat a little bit less. And we assume the cost of clinical mastitis case during the lactation of $217 per case, again, based on literature. And just for you to have an idea, you don't have to worry about these numbers. I just want you to grasp what we did. As I said, we split our herds. We simulated 3 herds in average, low, and high bulk tank somatic cell count. These are numbers from California. So these are real numbers. And when we were looking at the DHI data and data from the farmers, we basically, what we did, we look at the distribution of cows per category of somatic cell count, distribution of cows per category of somatic cell count in each of these herds. So for instance, if we are talking about, let me show you here. If we're talking about a low book tank somatic cell count, these herds have many more cows in a low somatic cell count category at the dry off, this is the last day somatic cell count, than for instance, a herd with a high book tank somatic cell count. Again, this is California data. We look at this distribution. And also based on California data, we were able to calculate what would be the incidence rate of clinical mastitis and subclinical mastitis in the next lactation. And this column here of no antibiotics is applying that penalty of 62%. We did that for primiparous. This box is for primiparous. And so I'm just comparing here different categories of somatic cell count at dry off and the number of cows. As you can see, there is a different distribution within each of these herds. This box here, this part of the table is for primiparous. We did the same thing for multiparous, varying from 0.1 to 9.6, every 0.1 increase in the somatic cell. I'm talking about somatic cell count, but actually we use somatic cell score because we did on the log scale. Finally, we run our model. We built our model. As I said, was based on the herd average book tank somatic cell count, was also based on the number of cows, primiparous and multiparous in each category of somatic cell count at dry off. And then we put the cost of clinical mastitis and subclinical mastitis within that model. And we ran an optimization algorithm in which the objective was to minimize the cost of mastitis around the dry period. Basically, I asked my herd, tell me what I should do, which cows I should treat or not, in order to minimize the cost of mastitis around the dry period. And what we saw was that for a low book tank somatic cell count, the cost of mastitis around the dry period per cow or per primiparous cows would be about $29 per year. And we would basically treat animals above 107,000 cells at dry off. In this scenario, for this herd, we would be treating about 16% of the primiparous, and for the multiparous, the cost would be a little bit higher, would be $50.68 per cow per year. We would treat animals that had above 58,000 cells at dry off, and we would be treating about 67% of the animals. The same idea for herds with an average book tank somatic cell count, of course, because they have a greater number of cows in categories of somatic cell count with a higher risk of mastitis, we would be treating a little bit more animals. And in the high book tank somatic cell count, we would be treating again a little bit more animals, but still, regardless, we would have opportunities to stop treating some cows in all of these herds. And when we compare these numbers with a scenario of blanket dry cow therapy or no dry cow therapy at all, we see that selective dry cow therapy is the best alternative. However, we're going to discuss a little bit more these numbers, but one thing that is important to consider is what Alfonso said. Scherpenzell, which is the paper that we used or we based our penalty for the selective dry cow therapy, they did not use teat sealant. So when we look at the work done by Vasquez and the work done by Rowe, which is actually the algorithm that Alfonso presented, we can see at these two papers, they used teat sealant. Vasquez used an external teat sealant, Rowe used an internal teat sealant. There are differences, slightly differences between the design of these trials. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here in details because Alfonso has done that already. But what we did, we said, okay, so what if we apply the tool that we developed using the outputs or playing a little bit with the outputs of these two papers that were done in the US and using teat sealant. So that's exactly what we did. So the first question was, what if we treat all cows above 200,000 cells or a linear score of 4? We keep the risk of clinical mastitis equal because these papers did not see a statistical difference in the incidence rate of clinical mastitis in the subsequent lactation, but we vary the risk of subclinical mastitis in the subsequent lactation. What if we do that? So that's what this graph is showing. So basically, the 0, 10, 25, and 100 is showing the penalty. 0 means that the teat sealant works as well as the intramammary antibiotics. So there will be no increased infection in the next lactation because you're using teat sealant. This means that teat sealant will increase the risk of intramammary infections, only subclinical mastitis in the subsequent lactation by 10%, by 25%, and by 100%. And this is comparing with blanket dry cow therapy. So when we look at the numbers here, the blue bar is primiparous, the orange bar is multiparous. This is the total cost per farm per year. Remember, this is a 1,000 cow herd. So basically, the opportunity, when I compare these numbers here, the opportunities here on this orange box, even if my teat sealant, and this is an important thing, this is considering an average herd in California for book tank somatic cell count. So even when my teat sealant is even when I use teat sealant, even if it doubles the risk of subclinical mastitis in the subsequent lactation, it's still not worth to treat primiparous or multiparous that have a last somatic cell count of below 200,000 cells. And the savings for a 1,000 cow herd per year would vary between, $6,000 and $80,000. Now, what if we treat all cows above 200,000 cells, and we vary the risks of both clinical and subclinical mastitis in the next lactation? And that's what this graph is showing, and the take-home message is here. So only in the case that the use of teat sealant doubles the risk of clinical and subclinical mastitis in the next lactation, which is this scenario here, I would be using, I would be treating some of my primiparous and multiparous cows that have a somatic cell count at the last test day below 200,000. Basically, we'll treat all primiparous above 31, would be, not all, sorry. Yeah, all primiparous above 31, I'll be treating 61% of all primiparous, and all multiparous above 38,000, I'll be treating around 74% of my multiparous. And the savings would vary between $600 and $6,000 per year for this herd. So what are the next steps for this work? We would like to combine different criteria for cow selection. As Alfonso said, that's the $1 million question: which cows I should enroll or not in a selective treatment at the dry-off. So we would like to improve the criteria. We would like to consider the effect of season. Maybe we can do that, for instance, during the winter, but not during summer, or the other way around, depending on the characteristics of each farm. And of course, further research is warranted looking into the records of herds using selective dry cow therapy in California. And the take-home messages here is that there is potential for implementing selective dry cow therapy in California herds. It's not for everyone. Bulk tank somatic cell count may be a decision factor, and the distribution of cows within categories of somatic cell count per herd is also a decision factor. But for that, we need good record keeping and good analysis of records. With that, I would like to thank you all that have been with us here for almost 2 hours now. I would like to thank all the dairy farmers who shared their data with us, the veterinarians that helped us to interpret the data, gave feedback on the model, and of course the TQVMA for giving us the opportunity to present our work here. And before I start the discussion and start answering some questions you may have, I would like to say that this tool that we have now, we are actually working with some collaborators from industry and CE advisors. We are looking at specifically at individual herds data to understand a little bit more on the risks, groups of cows. We can play with that, and then we can use the tool with each herd's inputs to understand a little bit better or what would be the costs of mastitis around the dry period. So if you are interested in, or you have someone or a herd that would be interested in looking at the data, just please contact me. I would be super happy to help. And I'd like to thank CDFA because they're funding this research, Varningen and Agritech. Thank you very much. Let me stop sharing this presentation now. And let me see here. So yeah, if you have questions, you can send these questions on the Q&A box. Let me see here. Oh, we have a question. I think I will respond this question. So Francisco Rivas has asked us a question. Was the last test somatic cell count used regardless of how many days since the last test have passed? That's actually a very good question. So he wants to know what we are considering last test day, because sometimes the last test day of a cow was like 90 or 120 days before she was really dried off. In the case of the work that we did for California, we excluded all cows that had a last test day that was greater than 45 plus, then 105 days before the next calving date. Because in the records, not all cows have the dry off date, especially on the DHIA record. So we considered a last test day 105 days before the next calving date. So if you consider that on average, it's a 60 days dry off, we're talking about 45 days maximum that cows had to have a result of a last test day. Otherwise, we excluded the cows. I hope I answered your question. Emmanuel, Alfonso, does anybody would like to ask another question or make a comment? If someone wants to ask a question instead of type, I think I can give, I think I can allow, you just have to raise your hand and then I can allow you to talk. Otherwise, I will, we've been here for almost 30 minutes after we had initially planned to be. All right, so we recorded this webinar. We're going to send to everyone the link with the recorded webinar. And our emails will also be available. So if you have any questions, if you want to see the slides, if you want to discuss the specific situations for the dairies that we work with, feel free to contact us. We will be happy to help. And I think I'll let Nadia conclude this webinar. If Emmanuel and Alfonso wants to say something, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you for attending.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much to all the participants for listening to us, and thanks to TKVMA for giving us this opportunity. We really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again to you guys, Emmanuel, Alfonso, and Fernanda, for sharing your presentations with us and also being very flexible with our scheduling and format, because we've had to reschedule this a few times. So thank you to you guys. Thanks to everybody listening in today, and to our TKVMA members. Be on the lookout for another email later this evening if anyone's interested in small animal CE opportunities. I just found out about a few today, so I'll be sending information to you all about that. And there is at least one more large animal webinar available through Elanco that will be happening next Tuesday, I believe, May 19th. So I'll include details about that. But that is all I have for announcements. So I think that's it for us for today.
All right, great.
Nadia.
Thank you.
Thanks.